All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, I should say. You're in a different time zone than me. I come from talking to you in Columbia, South Carolina, in the United States, where it is 2:30 in the afternoon. But good evening, everybody else, if you're in Europe. Welcome to our panel on approaches to Jewish architecture from nationalism to postmodernism. My name is Saskia Koenen-Snyder. I'm an associate professor of modern Jewish history at the University of South Carolina and in the United States, and I will be chairing this panel for you today. A little bit about myself. I published my first book on the topic of synagogue architecture, which we'll be talking about today, and published that with Harvard in 2013. Was entitled Building a Public Judaism, Synagogues and Jewish Identity in 19th Century Europe. And this book examined synagogue architecture and building practices by Jewish communities in 4 different cities. It was a comparative analysis: Amsterdam, my hometown, London, Paris, and Berlin. It was a comparative study about how Jews strive to represent themselves aesthetically in the public sphere and how they wanted to be seen by others. I'm currently finishing up my second book, also on a material culture object, not a building this time, but a much smaller and portable object, namely the diamond. And for now, it's entitled A Brilliant Commodity, Jews and Diamonds in an Imperial Setting, which analyzes the role of Jews in the diamond trade in the 19th century in South Africa, America, and Europe. We have 3 wonderful speakers for you tonight. I will briefly introduce all 3 of them to you here, and then I'll give the floor to our first presenter. Our first speaker will be Dr. Vladimir Levin, and he's the director of the Center for Jewish Arts at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's born in St. Petersburg, and Dr. Levin holds a PhD from Hebrew University. And he's the author and co-editor of numerous books, including From Revolution to War, Jewish Politics in Russia, 1907 to 1914, published in 2016. Synagogues in Lithuania, a catalog, which he co-edited, and together with one of our other presenters today, Sergei Kravtsov, Synagogues in Ukraine, Volhynia. He's currently working on a book analyzing Jewish material culture in Siberia, a project that he's undertaking with Anna Berezin. Dr. Levin has published extensively on East European Jewish history, particularly on its socio-political and religious complexities, synagogue architecture, and ritual objects. He's done numerous research expeditions to document synagogues and Jewish material culture in Eastern and Central Europe, and he has initiated several research projects in Jewish art, including the Bezalel Narkis Index of Jewish Art, the world's largest digital depository of Jewish heritage. Our second speaker is Dr. Ulrich Knufinke. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly? Yes, perfect. Knufinke, who comes to us from the Technical University Braunschweig in Germany. Dr. Knufinke studied architecture and German literature at the Technical University Braunschweig, where he earned his PhD with a dissertation on Jewish cemetery architecture in Germany, and that was published in 2007. In 2014, he got his Venia Legendi from the Universität of Stuttgart, and for many years he worked as a researcher at the Bet Pilah Research Unit for Jewish Architecture at the Technical University in Braunschweig, in cooperation with the Center for Jewish Art. Dr. Knufinke has worked since 2018 at the Lower Saxony State Authority for the Preservation of Monuments, as well as directing the Research Unit for Jewish Architecture. And Dr. Knufinke will talk to us. His talk is entitled Synagogues and Jewish Community Centers in Germany as Architecture of Remembrance and Jewish Empowerment After the Holocaust. Our third and last speaker is Dr. Sergei Kravtsov, a research fellow at the Center for Jewish Art, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's born in Ukraine. We've got quite a mixed bunch among us, right? People from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Germany. And so it's very much a mixed bunch among us. Born in Ukraine, he was trained as an architect and town planner in his native city of Lviv. He received his doctoral degree in architectural history from the Institute for the Theory and History of Architecture in Moscow, Russia in 1993, and he moved to Israel a year later. His research areas are the history of town planning, architectural theory, and the history of synagogue architecture. He is the author of Die Gildene Reuse, the Two-Reiser Synagogue in Lviv, published in 2011, and in 2018, In the Shadow of Empire, Synagogue Architecture in East Central Europe. He's also co-edited or co-authored Synagogues in Lithuania catalog, and with Vladimir Levin, Synagogues in Ukraine, volume. And Dr. Kopsov will enlighten us about temple iconography in the 19th and early 20th century synagogue architecture. So let us turn to our first speaker, and Dr. Levin, whose talk is entitled Synagogues in 19th Century Eastern Europe and What May Be Learned from Them. So take it away, Vladimir, and I'll keep track of time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Saskia, for such a kind introduction. Jan, are you showing the presentation? Yeah, thank you. And how can I move through it? Jan?
Down. You can just scroll it up and down. Just use your mouse.
Doesn't work. Sorry, it doesn't work. What we are doing?
Okay, I can wait for you if you want.
Okay, let's try. Let's try like in old times when there were slides and you had to ask people
just let
to
me
move.
Let me know when you want to change slide. I'll do it.
Okay, thank you very much. It will be funny. Okay, so I would like to start with a general note that the research on European synagogues had begun more than 120 years ago. And during the entire 20th century, it was mostly performed in the framework of the history of architecture. People who conducted this research were trained historians of art or architecture, and they developed and discussed inter alia typology of ground plans, aesthetics of architectural styles, and the interconnections between various buildings. In the last 20 years, however, the study of synagogue architecture significantly changed. I would even dare to say that this study today is less concentrated on architecture and more on the synagogue, and it aspires to discover social meanings and mental perceptions. Therefore, when the colleagues from the Polin Museum asked me to propose a panel for the conference named What's New and What's Next, I was very glad that I could invite as presenters and as a respondent scholars who contribute to this new direction of synagogue research. And I'm sure that we will learn something new from Sergei Ulrich and also from Saskia Notes. In my own paper, which bears a strange title, Synagogues in the 19th Century Eastern Europe and What May Be Learned from Them, I would like to present the study of the place of women in Eastern European synagogues and its connection with the modernization process of East European Jewry. In order to be able to speak about Eastern Europe of the 19th century, however, we must start with Western Europe and from medieval times. Jan, please, next picture. Thank you. One of the earliest synagogues we know, the Synagogue of Worms, could serve a good example to begin with. As we can see in the drawings from the book by Simon Paulus, the women's section on this synagogue was built a generation later after the men's prayer hall. It was attached to its side wall, and it was significantly lower. Ilya Rodov called such placement of a women's section hierarchical, and indeed it stresses the hierarchy between the genders. The architecture expresses the social and religious perception that rites and ceremonies performed by men are especially significant. The participation of women was also important, otherwise nobody would invest so much money into a special building. But it was inferior to that of the men. Next slide, please. This scheme, a lofty and prominent prayer hall and the low and insignificant women's section, became the norm in medieval and early modern Western Europe, as we can see here in Altneuschule in Prague. Next, please. Or in this charming drawing of a building that has to be recognized as the synagogue. So the women's section helps. And the situation changed only, next please, when Amsterdam Jews adopted the Calvinist model of a prayer hall with galleries and allocated those galleries for women. Next. This idea soon emerged in Germany too, and by the beginning of the 19th century, interior galleries for women, next please, became the most recognizable feature of the synagogue architecture in Western and Central Europe. Next. In Eastern Europe, however, the process went differently. We don't know much about the synagogues constructed in the 16th century, but in the 17th and 18th centuries, the hierarchical scheme or type was the norm, especially for the main synagogues of Jewish communities. Next. Low women sections were attached to the side walls of lofty prayer halls and connected to them through small openings. Probably many attached women's sections were built after the completion of the prayer halls, so that they looked completely different. And in other words, it was not important how the women's section looks like. Next, please. Even in the case when the prayer hall and women's sections were built simultaneously, the hierarchical relation between them were clearly expressed in architecture. Next, please. Somewhere in the mid-18th century, another type of synagogues began to spread in Eastern Europe, and I call this type under the same roof type, since the women's section was placed inside the building, under the same roof with the prayer hall, and you can see it on the left. I cannot point with my mouse, but you see the building of Beit Midrash with large windows of prayer hall and smaller windows of women's section. And it is very different from the hierarchical building of the great synagogue nearby, where there is a lofty prayer hall and small attached wooden sections. Such placement, the new placement of women's sections in the Beit Midrash, was a significant, what we see in Beit Midrash, was a significant move forward, since women moved from outside to inside and were now allocated a place in the same building as men. In other words, they became integrated into the main building of the Jewish community. Next, please, Jan. Thank you. This integration, however, was only partial, since women's sections were still divided from the prayer hall by a solid wall, and the connection was made through small windows, very similar to the windows that connected women's sections in the hierarchical synagogues. Next. The under the same roof type began to spread in the mid-18th century. That is the period when, according to Chava Weisler, the publication of women's prayer in Yiddish, Tchines, began to flourish, and many Tchines were intended for reading in the synagogue. In other words, probably more women visited synagogues from the mid-18th century. Moshe Rossman wrote that this period witnessed a new phenomenon when, I quote, "women are important from the religious point of view," unquote. The heyday of this type, however, came in the 19th century, when hundreds such synagogues were built all over Eastern Europe. This type continued to be used still in the early 20th century, but it was challenged by a new type of synagogues. Next, please. Let's look at the Great Synagogue in Slonim, a classical hierarchical building of the 17th century with low women's sections that were attached to the lofty prayer hall and have these windows connecting them to the hall. And at some point, and I assume it happened after the fire of 1881 or later, next please, the community built an interior women's gallery in this synagogue. It does not seem that the existing women's sections could not accommodate the growing number of female worshippers. Something have changed here. Something happened that forced the community to install the place for women inside the prayer hall, to bring them under the same ceiling with the men, and to include women into the sacred space, although in a gallery, but within the sanctuary. The reason for this is the arrival of a new type of synagogues from the West. Next, please. The first women interior galleries in Eastern Europe appeared, seemingly, in the Kupa synagogue in Krakow during its reconstruction in 1830-1834, and also in the temporary hall of the Brody synagogue in Odessa in 1847. The Brody synagogue in Odessa was the synagogue of the Maskilic minority which arrived from Galicia. And the example was very appealing. Next, please. So that the new building of the main synagogue in Odessa adopted the novelties introduced in the Brody synagogue. And these novelties include the decorum, the participation of a cantor with musical education and the male choir, the placement of the bima in front of the Torah ark, and the interior women's galleries. The design for the main synagogue, which you see on the screen, was made by Christian architects who were well aware of the contemporary European architecture, including the synagogue architecture. Next, please. When this synagogue was inaugurated, finally in 1860, Jewish travelers visiting it described the women's galleries as a novelty that they never saw before. And the description from the same year of 1860 of a newly built, next please, synagogue in Kolo in Congress, Poland, also stressed the placement of women's gallery, I quote, surrounding the sanctuary on three sides above the heads of the men, unquote. Next, please. So the main synagogue in Odessa, and especially the new Brody synagogue, inaugurated in Odessa in 1868, became the model for the choral synagogues that spread in the southern region of the Pale of Settlement in the late 60s and 70s. At the same time, choral synagogues were also established and built, next please, in the northern part of the Pale of Settlement, like this synagogue in Kovno, today Kaunas, where we can see on, if you look at the drawing at the lower right, you will see there is a bima in front of the Torah ark, and there is a women's gallery around on three sides of the prayer hall. Well, choral synagogues also arrived to the Russian capitals, next please, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and to other cities beyond the Pale of Settlement. Jan, next please. Thank you. The synagogues in Lithuania, Kurland, and St. Petersburg were constructed not according to the Odessa model, but they took inspiration directly from Germany, especially from the Oranienburgerstrasse synagogue in Berlin. Notwithstanding the name choral, which stresses the participation of the choir in the worship, the major features of those synagogues were the decorum, orderly sitting of the congregants in pews, and the prohibition to move around during the prayer, regular sermons by the rabbi, a cantor with musical education, often but not always accompanied by a choir. The placement of the bima in front of the Torah ark, but also not, we find it not in all choral synagogues, and the greater exposure of women on the interior galleries. By the 1880s, the choral synagogues became the synagogues of the economic, social, and intellectual elite, and as elitist organizations began to influence other strata of the Jewish society. Next, please. When the historiography deals with the elitist choral synagogues and their reception by ordinary Jews, it usually stresses the opposition of the traditionalists to the placement of the bima in front of the Torah ark. And you can see here the schemes prepared by David Magid of a typical Orthodox synagogue with bima in the center and typical choral synagogue with bima in front of the Torah ark. And indeed, the Orthodox and Proto-Orthodox circles vigorously opposed such placement of the bima and ridiculed rabbis' sermons. But it usually went unnoticed that other features of the choral synagogue spread without any opposition, and by the early 20th century became common in the mainstream synagogues, especially in the main synagogues of the communities. Musicologists have already paid attention to the fact but the special style of cantorial singing that initially distinguished the choral synagogues from the traditional ones spread very widely. And for example, I would like to quote Sholom Kaleb, who wrote, I quote, "The distinction separating the korshul, that is choral synagogue, from the mainstream large synagogue gradually tended to narrow and increasingly became irrelevant." End of quote. In the next picture, please. Similarly, the idea that the worshippers sit in orderly rows, preferably in pews, also spread very fast in the mainstream synagogues, as you can see in the picture on the right. So that the personal lectern ashtender remained only in smaller prayer houses, where, like the Vilna Gaon Klois that you see on the right, of course, where, like in this clause, the stress was made on the study and not on prayer. So the interior women's galleries also spread widely without any opposition. It was also a convenient solution from the architectural point of view, and new synagogues, especially the large ones, were constructed with galleries all over Eastern Europe. And at the same time, at the end of the 19th century, the existing synagogues, like one that we saw in Slonim, changed the interior arrangements in order to install galleries for women. There are many examples of existing synagogues introducing interior galleries, but I would like to show here only one. Next, please. This is the old wooden synagogue in Chita in Siberia. So here we see in red how the community wanted to change it and change it at the end. So they transformed under the same roof synagogue women's section into the under the same ceiling women's section, and you can see how they introduced women's galleries inside of the prayer hall. You can see it by red lines in the central plan in the center of this picture. In such synagogues with interior women's galleries, it was the mechitza, the division, not the gallery, that divided traditionalists from modernizers. The traditionalists installed curtains of wooden lattices or other devices in order to prevent men from seeing women, while the modernizers didn't do so. In both cases, with the mechitza or without it, women were already placed inside the prayer hall, and their presence was much more significant than in the other two types of synagogues, where the connection between male and female spaces was made through small windows. Next, please. And I would like to summarize. We saw three types of Eastern European synagogues with different placement of women. The hierarchical one, the under the same roof, and under the same ceiling types. All those types existed already in the 17th century, but what is important is their frequency among the non-synagogue buildings. The spread of the under the same roof type coincided with changes in the traditional Jewish society and with the growing attention to women's presence in the synagogue in the 18th century. It, however, did not eliminate the gender hierarchy, since women's sections were still separated from the prayer hall. This allowed semi-independent women's activities, like reading Tchinis aloud and having a female prayer leader, Zogerke. The under the same ceiling type with interior women's galleries, in contrast, precluded the possibility that women can pray by themselves, but it brought women into the prayer hall and made them part of the congregation. The women were still separated and the hierarchical order still preserved, but the sense of inclusion, so contrasted with the traditional synagogues, is what singled out those buildings. The inclusion of women, although in galleries, was initiated by the choral synagogues, which insisted on the decorum and order during the service, but this feature spread to the mainstream synagogues in the late 19th century. Decorum and order meant essentially that the men are not saying prayers personally, in individual tempo and loudly, but they orderly sit in rows and silently listen to the prayer of the cantor and choir. Women in the interior galleries were also expected to do so. The synagogue now resembled not only the Protestant or Catholic church, but also the theater and concert hall. What we may learn from the synagogue architecture of the 19th century is that the construction of synagogues with interior galleries and the introduction of such galleries into the existing synagogues signified the arrival and adoption of new norms, the norms of the European bourgeois society. The move of a women's place in the synagogue from a separate to a shared space was one of the signs of those norms, which included inter alia the public appearance of husband and wife together and their presence in the same events. The passive behavior of the congregants, male and female, so different from the traditional mode of worship, was another new norm expressed by the synagogue architecture. The architecture of Eastern European synagogues not only reflected the arrival of new norms, it also contributed to their spread in the East European Jewish society. The imitation of the elite in the arrangement of synagogue interiors inevitably contributed to the adoption of those specific norms of behavior that were unseparated from this architecture. So thank you very much for your attention. And Jan, thank you very much for moving my slides.
Perfect timing, Vladimir. Thank you so much. I was checking it on my phone, but thank you for these wonderful presentations and for many slides that I have never seen before. So that was wonderful. Thank you. Let's move to our second presenter of the evening, Dr. Knut Vinke. Take it away.
Okay. Dear Saskia, dear colleagues, dear Jan, may you start my presentation, please? And I try to... I can do it on my own. Great, thank you. So I will start. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about the development of synagogue architecture in Germany, especially in the years since 1945. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, dear Saskia, for your introduction. I would like to begin with a quote of a press release. This does not work. Quote, on 13th of March 2007, Federal Minister of Finance Per Steinbrück will present the special postage stamp Jewish Center Munich. With this stamp, the Federal Ministry of Finance is honoring the return of Munich's Jewish community to the heart of the city and thus to the center of society. Charlotte Knobloch, president of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, was deeply impressed by this gesture. Now a quote in the quote. Stamps are contemporary documents that reflect the self-image of a nation. I am therefore very pleased, 62 years after the personality cult around Hitler, to see motifs on stamps today that clearly show democratic self-image. End of both quotations. With this press release, the Jewish community of Munich and Upper Bavaria invited to the presentation of the stamp Jewish Center Munich. What applies to a stamp to reflect the self-image of a nation should apply even more to the image on it. It shows a stylized section of the facade of the synagogue on Jakobsplatz in Munich. More than almost any other building task, the architecture of synagogues in Germany since 1945 has also been a symbolic, an architecture of remembrance. The commemoration of the destruction of the synagogues and the annihilation of the Jewish communities during the National Socialist era is an essential element of the intentions of the clients and architects and of the perception by the public of all Jewish institutions built since then. After the Holocaust, it was hardly imaginable that Jewish life in the land of the perpetrators could ever develop again in Germany. A report by Richard Kirn on the first service in Frankfurt's West End Synagogue on 12th of September 1945 points out, quotation, it was the most shattering hour since the Americans moved in. Now, in the last Jewish place of worship in the city of Frankfurt, which vicious hatred had not completely destroyed, sat the rest of this congregation, in a room that was still without an organ, without the old pews, but in which comforting candles were already burning again, sat those who had escaped from the extermination camps, those who had been saved from the gas chambers, a heartbreakingly small number. Here the deepest desecration of the German name was carried out. Guilt was heaped upon us for centuries. The best among us will live in an eternal sense of guilt. End of quotation. The report illuminates both the precarious situation of the Jewish survivors and the significance of their very existence as a reminder to non-Jewish German society. The Jewish community and its synagogue had become a memorial to hold on to the eternal feeling of guilt. End of quotation. The survivors of the camps, who lived as displaced persons in Germany and for the most part hoped to emigrate soon to Palestine, the US or other countries, developed a remarkably rich religious life in their provisional accommodation in some places. For example, in a barrack of a former prisoner of war camp in Hesse, they set up a prayer room which was quite elaborately painted. In the same camp, the DPs erected one of the first Holocaust memorials in Germany, but it is lost today. Most DPs emigrated by the beginning of the 1950s. The DP communities dissolved. It was not until the end of the 1940s that it became apparent that Jewish communities could establish themselves in Germany in the long term. After all, the desire for new community facilities arose. One of the earliest examples of a completely new building is the Synagogue of Stuttgart by Ernst Guggenheimer, who survived the Holocaust hidden in the area of Stuttgart. Built until 1952 on the foundations of the main synagogue destroyed in 1938, it is a building in which a link to the synagogues of Weimar area is not only visible, but was also intended by the architect. He understood the modern style, Neues Bauen, new building, as a form of design that corresponded to the simplicity and originality of the Jewish rite. The reconstruction of the synagogue in Rohnstraße in Cologne, inaugurated in 1959, attracted great public attention. After 1938 and the bombings of the Second World War, the synagogue stood as a ruin. The exterior was largely reconstructed, but the interior was reinterpreted in the spirit of post-war German modernism. Its architect was Holocaust survivor Helmut Goldschmidt. In a certain way, this abstract reconstruction coincided with the purified reconstructions of many war-damaged churches. The symbolic political significance of the reconstruction of the Cologne synagogue is reflected in the greeting of the Federal Chancellor Konrad Adenauer at the inauguration. Quotation: "I'm pleased that the oldest Jewish community in the Rhineland, whose history can be traced back to Roman times, after more than 20 years will once again have a dignified place for its services. This seems to me to be visible proof of the success of the federal government's reparation policy and a confirmation of the freedom of religious confession and cultural activity guaranteed in the Federal Republic of Germany." End of quote. Of course, we can discuss all these quotations for a long time, but I won't do that now. The reference back to the long Jewish tradition in Cologne is not only evident in the restoration of the synagogue's exterior, but also in the installation of a foyer in which exhibits on the history of the Jewish community are displayed. You can see it here on the left. Another chapel-like memorial room in the foyer of the prayer room on the first floor commemorates the Holocaust. The two sides of remembrance, historicization and sacralization, are evident here. Places of remembrance for Holocaust victims were integrated in various ways into almost all synagogues and community centers of that time, whether as separate rooms, as in Cologne, or as artistically designed memorials. Not infrequently, spolia from the destroyed synagogues found place there. These sites almost always accompany the entrance to the synagogue. Entering the prayer room should forever be linked to remembrance. In the 1950s and 60s, most Jewish communities sought to build new buildings that developed various architectural forms of remembrance. In the 1950s and 60s, symbolic architecture was created that could represent remembrance through location, material, and form, and at the same time can be classified as examples of post-war modernism in the development of sacred buildings. One example is the synagogue in Dortmund, inaugurated in 1956, again designed by Helmut Goldschmidt. The synagogue is part of a larger community center that was built far from the site of the synagogue destroyed in 1938, in a quiet residential area. The center included a home for the elderly and rooms for the youth, but also offices and a banquet hall. It was intended to give community members a protected place of fellowship. The feeling of living on packed suitcases was dominant for many Jews at that time. And they didn't search for a place in the public, in the city centers, where the synagogue could be seen from all sides. Perhaps this is why Goldschmidt's synagogue design is not reminiscent of a permanent place of worship, but rather of a tent, the wandering sanctuary of the wandering Jewish people, of a people in Dortmund that would take its suitcases and move from Germany. With the increasing distance from the Holocaust, it became more urgent to find legible metaphors and symbols in architecture that could symbolize the historical events without explicating them. One of these metaphors is that of the rupture or break with which the Holocaust divides history into a time before and a time after, a secularized concept of religious turning points. Depicting the break has been attempted again and again since the 1980s in the context of buildings and memorials in Germany. The broken tablets of the law in the facade of the community center in Frankfurt, which was completed in 1986 according to a design by Salomon Korn, are prominent. Korn was later head of the Jewish community of Frankfurt. One of his colleagues that he did not like was the architect Alfred Jacobi, also a member of a Jewish community of that in Offenbach on Main, the next bigger city next to Frankfurt. Alfred Jacobi's approach to the design of the synagogue in Darmstadt is superficially opposed to the concept of rupture or break. This was probably the first attempt in Germany after 1945 to formally allude to a historical synagogue in a way that could be called postmodern. Jacobi took up the scheme of the domed synagogue buildings in an abstract manner. You can remember the synagogue of Dresden by Gottfried Semper or other synagogues with the dome and two smaller towers in the front. As you can see here, like rebuilt in a glass cupolas. For the interior design, especially for the Torah Ark, Jacobi chose another example. He looked at the Orthodox synagogue of 1906 in the city, which was destroyed in 1938. Inaugurated on 9th of November 1988, 50 years after the destruction of the city's two historic synagogues, it was the declared intention of the city and its politicians to use the new community center as a means of giving back, and thus linking up with the history before the Holocaust. After a phase of stagnation in the development of the Jewish communities, which hardly produced any new buildings between 1965 and 1990. Darmstadt was one of the few examples for that time. After 1990, a wave of new construction began with the influx of Jewish immigrants from the states of the former Soviet Union, which has lasted until the present. The buildings attract a great deal of public attention. For example, the inauguration of the Munich synagogue in 2006 was reported on the front pages of the newspapers and in the main news bulletins on television, also internationally. And the building is probably the only new synagogue in Germany to be immortalized on a postage stamp. You can see it in the corner. While the Munich synagogue on Jakobsplatz occupies a location that has no historical precedence and merely uses its name, Ohel Yaakov, Jacob's tent, to refer to both the name of the square and that of the city's destroyed Orthodox synagogue, another project by the architects Wandel, Höfer, Lorch and Hirsch is in many ways an architecture of remembrance. The Synagogue of Dresden, inaugurated in 2001, shows multiple forms of remembrance despite its abstract sculptural form. The complex of the synagogue and community center surrounds the site of the synagogue destroyed in 1938. I don't think, can you see my mouse? No, I don't think so. Yes, you can see? No. So it's, you have on the left the ground plan, on the bottom the community center, on the top the synagogue between some trees, and there is a little, in another direction, the ground plan of the synagogue of Gottfried Semper, built in 1838 to 40. An outline traces this footprint of the Semper synagogue in the courtyard of this example. The only surviving spolia of the old synagogue is a Star of David. It was put above the entrance of the new building. While the Dresden Frauenkirche, a memorial to the bombing war since its destruction, was being reconstructed at the same time, the competition for the new synagogue had opted for a design that explicitly did not rebuild the historic site. The sculptural minimalist architecture, nevertheless, makes the synagogue building a monument. Its forms don't originate from the shape of Semper's synagogue, but are found in a symbolic spatial and textual constellation remembering history. The twisted cube is hardly to be understood as anything other than an allusion to the temple and the Wailing Wall. The interior picks up on the tent of the wandering ark of the covenant with a suspended metal curtain that encloses the actual prayer room. Despite a completely different architectural language, the community center in Mainz by Manuel Herz, completed in 2009, after a competition that was around 10 years old, is comparable in its meaningfulness. For the site of the historic synagogue in Mainz, Herz designed a community center with a moving silhouette on a broken arched ground plan. The architect's explanations tell us that the shape of the folded ribbon was created when he laid it over the outline of the letters of the Hebrew word Kedusha. Herz reads many other details as allusions to the Jewish textual tradition. For example, the gold-colored surfaces of the synagogue room are covered with ornamental, stylized Hebrew letters, which in some places become actual legible inscriptions with Torah quotations. Coming to an end. To the viewer, informed by the architect's self-interpretations, buildings such as the Mainz synagogue become legible, but without an explanation, they remain unusual sculptures and thus refer to something non-ordinary, but also indecipherable, unreadable. Just as a new building on the site of a destroyed synagogue, one rewrites and thus writes history, memory shifts from the visible to the no longer visible. What is inscribed and overwritten on the object becomes a palimpsest of open and concealed traces. Traces regarding the site where a synagogue once stood that was destroyed. Traces as historical material that was reused as spolia. Traces in historical building structures that were revived and redesigned. Newly laid traces through formal adoptions of historical models or through symbolic, metaphorical and textual references. Perhaps the resulting illegibility and unspecific remembering is the only architectonic artistic equivalent to the non-representability of the Holocaust. Remembering that beyond any banalities will find precisely no coherent canon of iconographically readable, unambiguous forms. Without question, with synagogues such as those in Munich or Mainz, Jewish communities have reappeared in the cityscape of Germany. But to whom are such architectural sculptures addressed? How will they be read by a non-Jewish majority whose historical consciousness is slowly moving away from a responsibility to remember? How meaningful are such built memorials for present and future Jewish communities? This may be questions to be asked by future research and answered by a changing society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ulrich. That was wonderful, thought-provoking, beautiful images too. I enjoyed listening and watching that. And I hope we have time, we will have time afterwards for some questions about that, which I'm sure we'll have. Okay, let's move on to our third presenter of the evening, Dr. Sergei Kravtsov. Look forward to what you have to say to us and enlighten us as well. So the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening, and thank you for inviting me. I'll try to drive forward my presentation. Just I'm trying to click. Oh, it works. The Temple of Jerusalem remained a meaningful Jewish icon along the 19th and early 20th centuries, despite new directions and splits in Judaism. Architectural history and exegetic studies provided increasingly rich material for visualizing the Jewish temple or the temples. The main form of an imagined temple was graphical reconstruction, engraved and printed to serve an audience of diverse interests. My presentation discusses these visual and meaningful expressions used by architects to frame the varied Jewish group identities in a built form. Unprecedentedly influential reconstructions of the temple emerged in the 17th century. These works illustrated exegetic treatises, adding the explanation of sophisticated spatial concepts in the context of sacred history. By necessity, these works operated almost without archaeological evidence, using biblical and non-biblical descriptions. Hence, conjunction was the main methodological device. One of the most impressive images of the temple was produced by the Jesuit Juan Bautista Villalpando. He represented the temple of Ezekiel as a cosmic model corresponding to the 4 cardinal points and elements, 7 known planets, and the 12 tribes of Israel. Probably, therefore, Villalpando's semantic model was eagerly adopted by an 18th century Jewish artist to depict the Well of Miriam. As an architectural theorist, Villalpando, sorry, something went not very smooth. Now it doesn't move forward. Oh, now. As an architectural theorist, Villalpando contended that Ezekiel's temple accorded with that of Solomon, and hence its architecture had been a divinely inspired pattern. He invented a peculiar architectural order of the temple, allotting it with Doric triglyphs above the Corinthian capitals, and insisted on its priority over the Greek and Roman orders described by Vitruvius. He also provided the walls retaining the Temple Mount with recognizable concave buttresses. In the 17th century, the long-established reconstruction of the Herodian temple by Maimonides underwent a serious revision by Yom Tov Lipman Heller. This Tosafist believed that certain details of the second temple had originated from the previous one and hence could be used to construct the Messianic temple. Among such features, he saw the broad western front of the temple, which epitomized the Messianic temple as a line narrow behind and wide in front. Such layout of the second temple was accurately reconstructed by a Christian Hebraist Constantine Lempereur and soon adopted by Heller. These works influenced many Christian and Jewish theories willing to depict the Mishnaic and Messianic temples. Just a series of images showing this influence. Sir Christopher Wren formulated the essence of this pre-Enlightenment approach to architectural history in general and the imagined temple in particular. Architecture is a divine art conferred to the humans and consequently developed by the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans before it arrived at the European nations. In the Enlightenment thought, the historical architectural discourse was also refreshed vis-à-vis Solomon's temple. After William Wilkins, the architects of Syria and Greece were guided by the same general principles in the proportions of the essential parts of the buildings, and no substantial difference could be found between the temple in Jerusalem and those in Paestum and Aegina. The reinstatement of the historicist approach entailed novel reconstructions of the temple, which coincided with archaeological discoveries resulting from the French campaign in Egypt and Syria. The most influential works belong to Alois Hirt, Christian Stieglitz, and Luigi Canina. As one can see, the paradigm of the French Enlightenment, together with the neoclassicist canon, visibly faded out along the decades preceding the academic reconstructions by Melchior Vauguer. Unearthing of ancient Egyptian arches gave a new impulse to a reinterpretation of Egyptian architecture, which previously was considered more primitive than that of the Greeks and Romans. This discovery and publications of the early 1900s left no trace in theoretical reconstructions of the temple, but they, as I will show, would generate new ideas in synagogue architecture. Architectural discoveries in the Mediterranean basin and Mesopotamia brought new ideas regarding the possible appearance of the temple. An attractive pattern was proposed in 1887 by Charles Chipier and Georges Perrault. They characterized their graphics as restitution of biblical Ezekiel's vision, a blending of idealism and reality. They argued that Hiram of Tyre, who built the temple, followed the forms of his native Phoenician architecture. The Phoenicians, unlike the Jews, were involved in the cultural exchange with most of the peoples of the Mediterranean basin and Mesopotamia. Accordingly, the Shipesian reconstruction integrated Phoenician, Assyrian, and Egyptian architecture and archaeological finds in Palestine. Bernard Stade proposed an Assyrian reconstruction almost simultaneously with Chipier, whereas archaeologists renounced the Shipesian theory in the early 20th century. That by Stade survived into the 1970s as a veritable suggestion by Theodor Busing. The aforementioned reconstructions reflect grand narratives sensitive for those knowledgeable in the scriptures and architectural theory. These narratives entail the story of Solomon's temple as a fundamental point in Jewish history and general construction law. The second narrative is the Temple of Ezekiel, a model of the Messianic temple in Judaism and Christian millennial thought, and a pattern for the triumphant church in Catholicism. It is also an impressive architectural fantasy backing to the Temple of Solomon in Villalpando's theory. The third narrative is the Herodian temple described in Midot and hinting at the Messianic temple in the thought of Heller. The fourth narrative exposes the Jewish Messianic temple itself. Here I will bypass the Romanticist narratives of diverse European nations and the Jewish place within them, such as the Rundbogenstil, Neo-Muresque, and other medieval topics. In my opinion, this might shift our focus from the comparatively narrow ground of architectural iconography to the vast and trampled field of stylistics. The discussed reconstructions were applied to the synagogue buildings following their respective publications. Villalpando's imagery impacted the great synagogues in Ruthenia and Volhynia, where the treatise was popular already in the 1620s. The influence is evident in the synagogues of Lviv and Ostrog. The points of alignment with Villalpando's book are the Corinthian capitals, the 9-bay ground plan, and the slanting buttresses. With the arrival of this pattern to Amsterdam, initially to the Great Ashkenazi and then to the Great Portuguese Synagogue, the four-pier layout was amended with the concave silhouette of the buttresses. The iconic meaning of this design was clear in Amsterdam due to the exegetic works of Jacob Yehuda Leon, sermons delivered at Esnocha's inauguration, and other textual and visual sources. Unlike in Amsterdam, the meaning of the 9-bay layout was not immediately commented on in Poland and Lithuania. Its semantics is disclosed by the Crown Rabbi of Dubno, who described the 9-bay interior of the local Great Synagogue as a dome which rests on 16 columns standing in 4 rows and not an obvious 4-pier hall. A comparison of the synagogue's columns to those of the temple is also recorded in Ostrog. The 4-pier layout of the masonry synagogues penetrated the wooden synagogues of the Commonwealth in the 18th century. It was combined with the corner pavilions standing for the nave chambers of the Mishnaic temple in Heller's Restitution, which was eagerly published and commented in the region. The meaning of a broadened front synagogue as a model as modeled on the Herodian temple surfaced in Shklov, where a masonry synagogue was said to be kind of Herodian building. In these edifices, like in many other contemporary synagogues, both masonry and wooden, the broadened front was combined with a 4-pier and a 9-bay interior. In the 19th century, the broadened synagogue's front was often combined with in grand urban projects with the Rundbogen and neoclassicist expressions, as was the case with the Great Synagogue of Warsaw. The Egyptian revival synagogues were designed during the first wave of general Egyptomania, which followed the Napoleonic expedition. As shows Karol Krinsky and others, The exterior Egyptian expression was not welcomed among the Western European Jews, as it was associated with Egyptian captivity and Jewish otherness. These communities refuted sublime designs despite the architect's intention to include Jewish architecture in a pedigree linked to the temple and a refined architectural theory. The Egyptian details mostly wound up in the synagogue's interiors as stylistic elements such as cavetto cornices and palm capitals, as in the synagogues of Bordeaux and Copenhagen. In Russian Empire, this expression was also present on the architect's palette and likewise rejected. The design for presumably one of the Odessa synagogues also envisions Villalpando's elements, Corinthian or palm columns topped by Doric frieze. Egyptizing temple patterns were comparatively attractive in Australia, in the circle of former prisoners in the United States and in Great Britain. Diana Applebaum shows that such a choice often depended on the Freemasonic background of the clients or builders. Remarkably, the Masonic ceramic myth is close to the pre-Enlightenment theory, and it is trivial that one of the early British lodges constituted on Rennes St. Paul's building site. The second coming of the Egyptian iconography owed to the works of Shipier, and accordingly it bore numerous Assyrian, Phoenician, and Palestinian details. Professor Yulian Zakharevich proposed it for the reconstruction of a neoclassicist progressive synagogue in Lviv. Though underpinned by a fashionable academic theory and distancing from the medieval and oriental styles, it was excessively exotic even for the educated community. Soon after the publication of this project, its concept was applied to the synagogues of Cairo, Riga, and Hradec Kralove. In Cairo, the Egyptian pattern was most appropriate, pointing to the Jewish lasting presence in Egypt, to the historic and the messianic temples, as the reconstruction by Shipier was based on Ezekiel's vision. The synagogues in Riga and Hradec Kralove were also readily accepted as fitting the nationalist aspirations of the neighboring groups under the imperial rule, though not taking sides in their wars of styles. Joseph Barsky picked up a very similar expression for his Herzliya Gymnasium in Jaffa. Here it served the Hebrew national romanticism and epitomized a little century of study. No. The third coming of Egyptian iconography surfaced in the West End Synagogue of Frankfurt. Designed as a then fashionable reform architecture edifice, it employed, according to the Ost and West Reviewer, suggestions from the early days of Jewish antiquity, the massive, serious well taken from Egyptian Assyrian architecture. This was to distance from the decorative forms of Moorish mosques, as was the main intention of Zakharevich in Lviv. Noteworthy, the new Western Synagogue used the same catenary and ogee arches that had been recently unearthed in Egypt, publicized by Auguste Choisy and mathematically interpreted by Georges Dracy. Other projects by renowned German and Austrian architects used these discoveries in commercial architecture, with explicit Oriental connotations.
Sergei, you're almost out of time. A few more minutes. Okay.
Yes. Right. Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you. Hector Guimard applied this form together with the lotus motif in a seemingly non-historicist Art Nouveau synagogue at Rue Pavée. The aforementioned Assyrian-informed reconstruction by Bernard Stade also made its way to the actual synagogue architecture, though after the First World War. That was in the Neolog synagogue of Hungarian Nyíregyháza. The Harry Frank Memorial Synagogue in Philadelphia, built by Arnold Brunner, inaugurated a new approach to the recent archaeological finds. The architect referenced the overall classical style and detailing of the Galilean synagogues in Kfar Baram and Nabratein. He was critical of the Shipier's and Perrot's reconstruction. Instead, he claimed that upon examining the ruined remains that exist today, it is evident that whether this art inspired the Greeks or was inspired by the Greeks, it was serious and important, and if circumstances had allowed it to develop, it would have probably continued on much the same lines as the art of Greece. In addition, the portico of Brunner's synagogue was influenced by Ezekiel's temple, as imagined by Will Pando, and the side elevations were influenced by Shipier, and thus this building attained a complex meaning, also inspired by the Ezekiel's vision. The archaeological evidence from the Galilean synagogues was also used in interwar Latvia, in the seaside synagogue of Mairie, built for the traditional Orthodox congregation and Jewish vacationers. The Mairie synagogue bore assorted meanings similarly to the Memorial synagogue. It combined the broadened front and the ascribed eschatological meanings of the Mishnaic temple on one hand, with the shapes of the Galilean synagogues on another. The resulting overall style of the synagogue exemplified neoclassicism of the contemporary semi-totalitarian Latvia. And to conclude, the references to the temple were a long-standing trope of the modern time synagogue architecture. The historicist Egyptian concept challenged the synagogue architecture in the first half of the 19th century when Reform Judaism muted Jewish messianism. Many communities shunned exotic appearance, and sophisticated architectural theories remained vague for the Jewish congregants. The eschatological visions appeared in the synagogue's exteriors only when the host society was ambivalent towards the synagogue architecture insofar as it refrained from the local ideological arguments. Nonetheless, even these humble visions often looked like distant retrospections. In its modernization, Judaism left room for various visual expressions of the past, present, and future, and allowed those diverse narratives to be combined, voiced, and heard. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. I'm very impressed that you powered through 95 slides within 20 minutes. That's great images there. Go ahead.
Many of these things are commonplaces, but nevertheless.
Absolutely, yes. So thank you all three, Sergey, Ulrich, and Vladimir, for your presentations. And I wanted to spend a few minutes on talking about certain themes I recognized in your work and listening to your talks today, but also reading them beforehand. I think the three of you touched on some similar themes. The first of which is the recognition that buildings matter, right? Buildings matter not merely as physical structures, but also very much as repositories of memories, reflections of Jewish identity. And your scholarship, I think, confirms that in order to gain a better understanding of Jewish architecture, the larger meaning of architecture, we need to venture beyond the field of architectural studies and consider history and archaeology and urban planning, Jewish-Christian relations, artistic movements, gender study, and the like. And we need to, and I think we have begun to, broaden our lens in that regard, that architectural history is more than just the drawings, and change over time. Ulrich has done so by analyzing synagogues and community centers in the context of post-war Germany, when Jewish religious structures are rebuilt in various what he called architectural forms of remembrance or symbolic architecture, producing synagogues that are both houses of worship and monuments to Jewish loss and renewed life. And Ulrich, I was really struck by the stamp you showed in the very beginning, because it almost looks like fabric, right? The fabric of it's textured, and it kind of gives us the impression of a multi-textured history. And I thought that was very appropriate, the way that they had designed the stamp. That it struck me visually when I looked at it. Sergei brought in a sensitivity to archaeological discoveries and artistic movements, feeding the imagination of architects as they thought about architectural styles. Vladimir, on his end, considered the effects of what we may call reform with a small r on synagogue architecture in Eastern Europe and Russia, one that is concerned with decorum and taste rather than with radical liturgical change, and the changing role of women in particular in Jewish society. So all three of you argued for an interpretation of architecture that is shaped by factors beyond the architect's drawing board. And I think if we have to think about what's new, what's next in the field of architectural history, that's it, right? Is that we look at these multi-textures and multidisciplinary components of the building itself, and thinking about going beyond the structure itself, but also to consider place and time, context, and all kinds of different aspects. I was also struck by a comment, I think Vladimir made it, I'm not sure who made it, I think it was you, Vladimir, in the beginning, that when we talk about Jewish architecture, it is rather, in Dutch we say frappant, it's rather striking that all three of you talked about synagogues, right? And it's Jewish architecture and Jewish synagogues are not necessarily synonyms, but that's where we were, that's where we are here. And buildings, not just synagogues, but all buildings are what we're learning, not lifeless structures that silently witness the passing of the ages, but that they actively shape our everyday experiences and shape narratives of the past as well as of the present. And aside from their practical use, then, buildings play really a crucial role in defining who we are or aspire to be as people. They communicate to the public cultural preferences, political ambitions, social ambitions, religious heritage, successes, failures. And people's use or neglect of buildings, their attempts to embellish them or vandalize them, and the desire to reproduce them reveals that they are not merely inert objects of reflection, but that they are mediums through which cultural practices are established and reproduced. And that's a complex story. So buildings, in a way, I treat it, and I think you do too, that synagogues and buildings as a whole as storytellers, right? They are storytellers. They tell us stories about the need for their existence, about the people who use them, about the events taking place inside or around them. And so your presentations reminded me of the work of a critical theorist named Lindsay Jones, whose work explored what he called the human experience of architecture. It's not merely about the building itself, it's about not just the physical form of the buildings themselves, but the dynamic interactions with human participants within a particular historical setting that produces an interpretation, that produces meaning of this building, illuminating its situational and transient nature as historical context continuously change. And so these meanings are also different at different times in history. So the meaning of a building, as in Jones's words, he said, is not a condition or quality of the thing itself, but it arises from situations at some specific time in some specific place. And so without contextualization, proper contextualization, the building remains silent. And if architectural meaning arises in relation to circumstance, I think we need a greater sensitivity to space and place in order to understand the meaning of synagogues, their function in the public domain, how they're perceived by others. So that's one of the themes I kind of saw running through your work, as that all of these things matter, right? In artistic movements, or when they appear, what style uses them, what it says about relationships or the positions of women in Jewish culture, sentiments about decorum and what's proper inside of what's considered proper at the time in synagogues. All of those things are important. A second theme that I saw running through your presentations, although sometimes quite subtly, is that of the architects, and many of whom historically have been non-Jews. And it wasn't always clear in your presentations who was Jewish, who was not Jewish. And this is again true in post-war Germany as well, as Ulrich discussed. Sergei talked about architects imagining temples, right? Imagining in their own fantasy what Jewish temples must have looked like in the past. And I wonder if we can unpack this a little bit further in our Q&A. What I looked at in my own work in the 19th century in Europe, particularly Central and Western Europe, it was mostly Christians who designed, for example, Moorish-style buildings, while their Jewish colleagues who came to the profession actually quite late because of restrictions passionately opposed it. Jewish architects in Germany in particular, and Ulrich can maybe expand on this later, Jewish architects generally avoided distinguishing themselves by specializing in a design that many considered to be un-German. The Jewish architect Albert Rosengarten, for instance, was one of them. His Romanesque-inspired proposal for a synagogue in Kassel featured classically German patterns. Edwin Oppler, one of the first Jewish architects to specialize in synagogues, had similar convictions. He designed houses of worship in Hanover, Breslau, Karlsbad, in late Romanesque to early Gothic styles to express German patriotism. And Oppler was convinced, and I quote him here, that a German Jew in the German state should build in a German style. And Moorish style was not one of those. He didn't consider that to be German, and that the familiarity of the Rundbogen style building would promote Jewish integration. After all, and I quote him here too, he says, a German Jew wants above all to be German. He suffers and struggles to obtain equality. Should his house of worship then isolate him? Should he let character traits and sentiments be ascribed to him that in no way contributes to his elevation in the eyes of his fellow men, solely due to the adoption of a Moorish style? When erecting a synagogue, the aim is to establish a beautiful as well as a national building, the requirement if it wants to become monumental, unquote. And so he didn't want to be associated with that, with the Moorish, what represented Moorish style architecture. And for German Jews to be associated with people from the East was in Oppler's mind, at least, damaging to the image and objectives. And so Moorish architecture, from his perspective, then kind of reaffirmed the quote-unquote foreignness of Jews and their connection to a different nation. And Oppler sought complete adaptation to the vernacular architecture in Germany at the time. And so this is also true for France, and it's then Christian architects who imagine Jews as Oriental, as almost exotic. And I wondered if, it's also colonialism comes creeping in here too. It's Oriental images, prevalence in French colonial culture, for instance, that has an effect on Christian architects, how they imagine, fantasize about previous or older styles in the Jewish population. And they imagine the synagogue as a place of mystery, full of what one called sounds of a distant land. Right? It's somewhat far away. And so I wonder if our speakers could elaborate a little bit on these comments. How much does your own research kind of look at where the architects are coming from, how they imagined or fantasized about the buildings they were creating for a population that they were not necessarily part of. They wouldn't worship in that building themselves. And maybe a little bit about how, when we're thinking about what's new in the field of Jewish architecture, maybe elaborate that a little bit on that as well. And so, and then I noticed a question in our chat box, and for the audience, please feel free to add questions, and I'll be happy to read them for you, and that we can address them in the time that we have left. Is there one of you who would like to pitch in on the comments I made? And so, if so, then please open up your microphones and feel free to add.
Could I?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead,
I have some strange feeling that you have missed my small point. I was
Enlighten
talking,
me.
but it's okay. It's very fine actually, and I can speak more
Okay,
because of
go
that.
ahead.
You see, I insisted that I'm speaking about iconography and not about the stylistic, because what you've told about Rundbogen or Oriental style or other medieval Eastern or European styles, it's another story. It's the story that everyone can see the style and attribute the synagogue to certain national trend and just say we are Orientals or we are Germans or we are Russians even and so on. But iconography is something else. As the author of the classical article on this matter, Richard Krautheimer, said that it's something intangible. It's the plan. It's the layout of the building. And with this media, architect can play a little bit independently from the stylistics and avoid quandary, let's say, of local styles war. This is an idea that I've got as a present from dear Sharman Kaddish, who edited one of my articles. So, say in Riga, we have a war of styles between Latvians and Germans who pretend that Riga is their city. In that case, Jews choose to avoid this quandary. The same story happens in Lvov, Lemberg, where Zakharevich, who was an Armenian, but that doesn't matter. He distances from the quandary between the Poles and Ukrainians. One party says our architecture is Romanesque, and others say no, it's Byzantine because of the place. So, and then Zakharevich, who was deeply involved in this quandary, says, for this temple for which I've been invited, let's produce something that is rooted long ago and doesn't belong to the quandaries of today. And for that reason, the project was rejected and for that reason published. So it's important that there is another story and another narrative beyond the national quandaries and the national stylistic wars. So that is what I tended to say, actually. Maybe
Good,
I was not explicit enough.
Thank you. Although I'm gonna, I still like to challenge you in that. Can we really see them as different, right? As in or unconnected? And so it's food for thought to see if there are separate narratives or if they're really overlapping or together or connected in some way, that they are not mutually exclusive in those regards, right? Others that want to pitch in, Ulrich or Vladimir. Go ahead, Vladimir.
No, I want to say Ulrich go first.
Oh.
That's smart.
I can do, because I think the last discussion on what is iconography and what is style in synagogue architecture is very important to look to bring this discussion to the present day synagogues of Germany. I think they are more looking for new or very special iconography than for a special sort of style. And this is what is important, what connects them with all these attempts of rebuilding a temple or whatever in mind. And here, of course, the remembrance of the synagogues that were destroyed is a very important point in it. Not remembering by rebuilding some forms, that's very seldom, but we have discussions now on rebuilding the synagogue of Hamburg in the same way as it was before it was destroyed in 1938. So there are discussions that remembrance needs the same image, rebuilding of an historic image, that this would be a good idea for remembrance. Until now, until this discussion on Braunplatz Synagogue, we have only one example that is the synagogue was rebuilt in the former shape in the last 20 years. That was in Herford, a really unimportant town in Westphalia. So this is a new discussion of rebuilding synagogue as it was before 1938.
Yeah. I was also to add to your comment, Ulrich, I was particularly also struck by the Darmstadt synagogue by Jacobi, that one of the elements in there that we hardly ever really saw before that is the security fence, right? If you look at the picture, that now has also become part of this, sadly so, but also the need, or now that we need a security fence around it, it becomes part of the architectural planning of buildings like that.
It wasn't designed in 1988. It was added later, but by Alfred Jacob. So it's another point in the development of German synagogues now in the last, let's say, 2 decades. When they got into the city centers, they should be protected more than they've been before. The synagogue in Dortmund, in this neighborhood of residential houses, was not protected. It was still not protected very much. But of course, buildings like in Munich have to be like a fortress.
Yeah.
And they are built like fortresses. Mm-hmm. Whether they have to be like that, I don't know. But it's the common sense that they have to.
Yeah, and maybe on a more positive note, what was also rather striking is that if I think about Jewish architecture and synagogue architecture in the United States, that we also see those overlapping in terms of, or similarities of creating community centers, not merely as a house of worship, but then also a broader idea about that a community center for other functions than religious functions, that they become centers of Jewish community life in ways that they may not have been before, which also means that they are oftentimes much larger, and they have spaces in those synagogues that were traditionally not part of a synagogue building, that now we see this, by the way, also in Christian churches in the United States, where they have a basketball court, because that's where the people on Sundays would take their children to go to services, but then have a basketball game afterwards. And so they become much broader in their definition of what a synagogue actually is, what a religious structure actually is, and the functions that they have in these modern communities. Vladimir, I'm taking up your time.
I would like to react to what you said just, to your last phrase. I think it's this creation, what you said, that the religious building becomes a communal center with much broader functions. It's the return to the pre-19th century, when the synagogues, as we see, and the churches as well, were not simply a place for prayer. It was much more a multifunctional space, and especially if we look at the Schulhöfen, the synagogue courtyards, which developed especially in Eastern Europe, but we can find them also in Central Europe in a little bit. But it's a complex, really communal complex, which answers the majority of communal needs. The 19th century turned the synagogue into a place for prayer, where you come on Saturday at 11 and you leave at Saturday at 2, and next time you meet it in a week. And the second half of the 20th century, the development of communal centers, it brings them back to the natural, maybe to the natural environment and to the natural function. But it's not only the place that you visited, you prayed, and you went out, that's all. But it's really the center of, as you said, the center of communal life.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this particularly in the 19th century too, that they begin to introduce weddings, just like a Christian church would do, have a wedding inside of a synagogue. That was
and so before that you had weddings outside the synagogue.
Yeah.
No, it's not somewhere in the city, it's not in the fields. It's outside the synagogue.
Yes.
It's still around the synagogue. So here it's
Good.
here's
Let me ask, I have some question before we run out of time. It's a question from Dr. Polonsky, Antony Polonsky, who asks, I think this is addressed to Ulrich. One of the features of the re-establishment of Jewish life in Germany has been the participation of Jews from Eastern Europe, even before the immigration of Jews from the former Soviet Union. What role did they play in the production of synagogues you have described?
That's a very interesting question, and I think Alexandra Klei, she's also with us this evening, will answer some of these questions in her book that will hopefully come out not in the far future. So I think these survivors from Eastern Europe were at a large number in the communities, of course, but they were not as influential as their number should say that. And they were not influential in the design of the buildings. And in some points, we can find traces of these East European traditions, for example, in wall paintings and some symbolic ideas in the synagogues. But I don't think that they really influenced the overall modern design. Of course, most of the post-war synagogues in Germany were built due to an Orthodox layout, not a Reform layout. And this is really a point that was made for bringing all these people from Eastern Europe also into these communities. That's an important point. Also, after 1990, the influence of the immigrants from Russia or from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet Union, on the design process is very little. Just during the last years, I think we can see that these immigrants are part in this design processes more and more, and perhaps bring their own ideas. But they are, of course, influenced by that what they find in Germany and what they have as a need for the community. And I think that combines the last discussion we had here with this question. The idea of the community center is really prevalent in all these designs, but the community centers were designed more and more as they were sacred buildings, entirely sacred buildings, so that we don't have a part that is the synagogue and the other part that is the communal center. They have an overall design of a sacred architecture. So it's a little bit the other way around as it was in the States. The synagogue got smaller and smaller, and the community center was a non-religious place, but a communal place.
Yeah. There's a really fascinating phenomenon in the US, by the way, too, for anybody's interested, that here exists a number of what they call churchagogues, where the Christian community and the Jewish community have collaborated in creating a building that is a church on Sunday and then a synagogue on Friday evening and Saturdays, and they call it a churchagogue. It's really used by both congregations as a really interesting way to promote German Jewish Christian relations. There's also a question from Ilya Lenskis to Sergei. He says, let me see, I think we can note that both in Riga and Lvov, the struggle between emerging former semi-peasant nations and old elite, and actually none of these groups was too willing to incorporate Jews. So Jews even didn't have to choose their loyalties and could freely think of their own style. Oh, I think this is more a comment than a real question that was asked.
Yes, I've read this question, and probably in Riga that holds true, but not in Lemberg, not in Lvov, where a large party of the Jews and Poles had been presented by the organization Przymierze Braci, and we know people who took part in it. Also, Nossig, at certain stage of his thought, was a part of this story. So it was important to the Jews to become a part of the of the Polish society after the decay of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and their disappointment after the pogrom of 1918 was even more bitter for this reason. But actually, from the Jewish side, there was such a moment, and there were also Polish politicians who supported it. It is quite a known phenomenon in Galicia. But in Riga, I suggest Ilya is right. Yeah, yes.
Good. Thank you all. We are slightly over time, which is a good sign, I guess, because we had some good things to talk about and looked at some and heard some wonderful presentations. I know it's after 10 o'clock in Poland right now, and for those attending the conference today, you must be, as they say in America here, you must be fried. By the end of the day, you've had heard and seen plenty. So I'd like to thank you all, Vladimir Levin, Sergei Kravtsov, and Ulrich Knupinke for your presentations, and for the audience for attending and for your questions and comments. And the story of the synagogue continues, I would say, right? And there's always, it remains a fascinating field, and from so many different angles, so many different places, and so many times in history. And so thank you all for coming today. And